all the well-known guerrilla organizations, but it also included this new Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, which emerged that same month. So the question as to whether the Israelis released a bunch of Hamas leaders, I think we can say without a doubt that the Israelis tried to practice, have always and still today tried to practice imperial-style divide and rule between specifically Fatah and Hamas, but also within different factions of Fatah, between the seculars and the religious, and many different ways they have tried to do that. And in the early 80s, they did give some support to Sheikh Ahmed Yassin to build his network of religious institutions as a way of countering the secular forces that were very active in Gaza at the time. The communists were quite active in Gaza in the early 80s. So there was a sense in which some of this stuff was supported by the Israelis, but that is how empires work. Divide and rule is what they do. Later, so the people in the occupied territories were trying to take things into their own control after 1982, especially with the outbreak of the first Intifada, but they still had this sort of loyalty, a leftover loyalty to the PLO. So when I'm trying to think who it is. Anyway, the community leaders from within the West Bank would be called in by George Shultz to come and, can we figure out a way to end this Intifada? They always said, no, you shouldn't talk to us, you have to talk to Tunis. You have to talk to Tunis. And they really wanted to have Tunis. They wanted to have Arafat and the PFLP and the DFLP all come back, and that was their prime demand. And then when Arafat did come back after Oslo, it was the hugest disappointment, because the people, especially in the West Bank, whom I knew really well, who looked at the text of Oslo, were horrified, because Oslo allowed the Israelis to continue having, not just having the settlements in the West Bank, but to build what they called bypass roads. So that the Israelis in that early period of Oslo completely transformed the human geography of the West Bank from one in which you had a few isolated Israeli settlements amidst a rich network of Palestinian cities connected by roads, into a geography in which you had growing settlements connected by beautiful US-funded bypass roads that divided up the Palestinian cities, which it became essentially ghettos. And all that was Oslo. And the people who were on the ground realized how damaging that was. So, the relationship between those people who had been in Beirut, or prior to that Jordan, and the people who were doing the work on the ground in the West Bank became very difficult, and that actually was a big factor in the rise of Hamas's popularity.
What a shame. Yeah. Whatever happened to Democratic Front anyway?
They split.
They were the good guys.
Yeah.
They were really good guys. Please.
I actually don't want to talk, but I want to be on
Oh, you can project.
I'm pretty loud. So, I heard a few things. I haven't read your book, so I don't know all the details, and I came in late, so I'm sorry about that. But you mentioned Hamas is getting popular. People are supporting it, right? Learning about, growing up here, right? You hear I'm Palestinian, right? But you hear all the negative things of the resistance and whatever group. But when you actually hear what Hamas is doing, kudos to them. I'm not saying kudos for Hamas, that's not what I'm saying, right? But kudos for them for being we are are going to stand and we are going to fight. Because if you look at the history of Palestine, right, there was so much more that happened before October 7th. And the fact that they had assistance from the Israelis to allow this to happen, right? But it was all a part of the plan. It wasn't a part of it was a part of the plan to be like, let's take over as much land as possible. It was a part of the plan to, let's try to annihilate Palestinians. It was a part of the plan to say, like, we want to be able to get into Gaza as much as possible. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I go on TikTok, I see the different groups that are very pro-Israeli that are saying, like, looking at Gaza and saying, this is our land, this is where we're going to do. So, yeah, the resistance group is phenomenal. There's always going to be a form of resistance when you're being suffocated. It's the only way that people are going to live and survive. Again, I haven't read your book, so I don't know the gist of it and stuff, but it sounded like a negative thing of there's other people or other countries supporting Hamas and the resistance, but no, it's a good thing. When you see a group of, like, any group, any just take the Maori group down in New Zealand. They stood up for something they believe in. So whenever there's resistance, it's a matter of taking a step back and saying, well, what are they actually resisting? What is the reason why people are now saying we want to be able to support them? So that was just, but I want to hear your perspective because it just sounded like it was a negative that people are supporting Hamas.
I think
Again, I didn't read your book, so
no,
I came in like.
No, I think you must have misunderstood the talk and also my comments, I guess. So, do you want to take this on? Because I mean, you've actually been very supportive of Hamas, actually, and you have in the book you actually write very positive things about Hamas. Some other people might not, but you do. So you really should read the book.
I want to hear
because she was also explaining that very well. I'm sure you were in the room, but yeah, I think you probably misheard something. Okay.
Yeah, I started off my talk by saying that it's really important that people understand that the right to resist foreign military occupation and colonial domination by all means necessary, provided it's within the bounds of international humanitarian law, is something that I completely support and that is guaranteed by international law. So, I mean, that was the framing for the whole discussion, and I'm sorry if you misunderstood or misheard what I was saying.
Again, I came in late, that's why I was saying like I
There you go. That was it. Okay. Yes. Another.
Should I comment?
Yeah, please, Roberta. And then the lady in the front.
Thanks. Helena, you had mentioned at the beginning of your talk about the differences between Hezbollah and Hamas, and you were going to come back to it. And then you also hinted at that in recent weeks there is some form of rapprochement maybe between Hamas and the Syrian government. So I'm a bit curious to know about both of these things. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That's in the book too.
So yes, the relationship between Hamas and Hezbollah, as I mentioned earlier, really cemented at a level of like military cooperation in 1994 with what you could call Hezbollah's military training university in South Lebanon, from which Hamas learned a lot, and they built really good relations. So one of the things, the main thing that affected that negatively was the Syrian civil war and the huge support that the US and Israel gave to the anti-government forces in Syria with a view to regime change in Syria. And doing this by piggybacking onto what they claimed were the democratic demands of the Syrian people. And they succeeded in driving a deep wedge in Syria between supporters of the government, and I call it a government, not a regime, because I recognize that it is the legitimate government of Syria, whose supporters inside the country, actually a majority of the supporters are Sunni Muslims, but there were various forces, Israel and the United States, and I have to say the government of Qatar, which sought to overthrow the government of Syria by supporting these Sunni Muslim extremists in Lebanon, in Syria, who they tried to portray in the West as being democratic Sunni Muslims, but actually they were ISIS, they were Al-Qaeda. They were also supported by Turkey and by the Jordanian government. Turkey, a member of NATO, government of Jordan being a puppet of our government here. And it was a vicious attack on the sovereignty of Syria that drove, and it was pursued in the name of like anti-Shiism. So that obviously drove a wedge between Hamas and Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is quintessentially a Shiite Lebanese Muslim organization. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, when I sat with the leaders of Hamas in a collegial kind of setting, it was in Damascus before this split occurred. But then when the situation between the Sunnis and so the government of Syria is dominated by members of a small Shiite sect called the Alawis, but they also have a coalition of all the non-Sunni Muslim minorities there, and also, as I mentioned, many Sunni Muslim supporters for the government. But the attempt to drive this Shiite-Sunni split was unbelievably successful from the point of view of the US-Israeli empire, and unbelievably damaging for the people of Syria. You know, millions of whom have been displaced either inside the country or externally, and major cities destroyed. And it continues until now with the Israelis bombing Palmyra, bombing, you know, pro-government and government forces in Palmyra. The government of Syria is in a terrible situation. And right now they are receiving hundreds of thousands, quite possibly as many as 2 million refugees from Lebanon, who are both Lebanese and Palestinians from Lebanon, who have been displaced by the latest Israeli attacks. So it's a shit show, is all I can say, honestly. What has happened to Syria. We tried in Just World Educational back in, I want to say 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, to have a reasoned discussion of the Syrian situation amongst Syrians and Palestinians and other people. It's very difficult to do that because feelings in this country run so high against the government of Syria and in support of this opposition in Syria, which is portrayed as democratic but is actually dominated by ISIS. So, I mean, the degree of disinformation involved has been massive. So I think two things happened in 2023 that eased this Shiite-Sunni split in West Asia. The first was the brilliant diplomacy of the Chinese, who in March of 2023 succeeded in bringing about a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia being like a quintessentially Sunni Muslim dictatorship, whatever you like to call it, close US ally, whatever. I mean, to me, that was a diplomatic coup of the first order by the Chinese, that they managed to do this, including that the Americans and Israelis, with all their hyper-sophisticated, intel and surveillance and whatever, didn't have a clue that this was going on. It was an amazing thing that the Chinese achieved, and that has lasting impact not only in the Gulf but throughout West Asia, and has led to a slow readmission of Syria into the Arab League and the easing of all those Shiite-Sunni tensions. And then the second thing that really helped ease the tensions was Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, the October 7th operation, which changed the dynamics of the whole region in so many different ways, including the fact that Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, who are Shiites, and Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran, all of them Shiite-led political military formations, have been the main supporters for Hamas. Whereas, all the Sunni regimes, governments, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the only one that is prepared to give the time of day to Hamas is Qatar. I mean, it's very confusing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's
Good. Yeah. The U.S. likes to take credit for having defeated ISIS in Israel, but in fact the U.S. has a lot to answer for the creation of ISIS, frankly, but that's another story. Let's see, we've got a question here, and then, yeah?
Just take it from here.
Oh.
I apologize that I came late also, and if you already addressed this, then I have a second question. On October 7th, you said you talk about October 7th more later. My son called and said, "Mom, why would Hamas do this?" And I hadn't actually heard what they had done yet. And I said, "Well, they've been in dire straits, and the only time I know that they've made much progress is back when they exchanged Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier, for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. So perhaps that's what they were trying to do." So part one is, if you haven't already gone into the goals that Hamas had for that day, if you happen to know. And the other thing is, we've heard so many descriptions of shooting people and the festival that reportedly Hamas didn't know about ahead of time, and atrocities that have been debunked afterwards, sort of like what kinds of things they did or didn't do that day that they may be ordered to do, or just some were fearful and did it wrong. And if you've already addressed all of that, then
No, I know you haven't, yeah.
all right,
Yeah.
then I'll ask that.
There were so many lies that were told about what happened that day.
So I realize that time is getting on, so I'll try and speak fast and make this as brief as possible, but it is important to understand what Yahya Sinwar and his military planners were trying to achieve on October 7th. As you mentioned, it was very much an operation informed by what Hamas had managed to achieve with the Gilad Shalit exchange of prisoners for hostages. It was a very carefully planned military operation whose goal, and this is quite clear actually, was to overrun Israeli military headquarters around Gaza in what the Israelis call the Gaza envelope, because the whole point of it is to envelop Gaza, and to take military hostages as high-ranking as possible, but any serving military man or woman they wanted to take. And I think they undertook the operation almost wholly alone, although there were other allied forces in the vicinity, but this specific targeting the military headquarters and taking captives was their main goal. And they succeeded beyond, quite possibly beyond what they had dreamt they could succeed. They overran the headquarters of the IDF Gaza Brigade. They overran the headquarters of the IDF's entire southern command. They overran the big military base that was just north of Erez checkpoint. And in each of these military bases, and in many other smaller military bases, they were able to enter, to seize control, and to take captives and take them back to Gaza. So the vast majority of the hostages who are still in Gaza are military, some of them very high-ranking military, including, as Maureen Rabbani pointed out in our conversation that's in the book, they also took a lot of computer hard drives and planning documents and other things. So in order to do this, which had required a lot of planning, they had to bust out of the concentration camp that Gaza had been for the last 17 years. And they breached the wall in something like 30 or 40 places. And as they did so, the people of Gaza, who, remember, most of them are refugees from precisely those lands around Gaza, and who have held on to the right to return, including in 2018, they mounted for more than a year this great march of return to try to breach the walls. So on the early morning of October 7th, 2023, the walls were breached. What did the people of Gaza do? These were men probably of all ages, and so far as I know, very few women, but they bust out of the concentration camp. And they stole bicycles. They stole tape recorders. They stole computers. They went back to grandmother's land. It was like an amazing thing to bust out of the concentration camp that they had been unable to leave for so long, penned into. And they had no discipline whatsoever. And so then they discover there's like a rock festival. They discover, that, there are people, they generally know that the goal of, they'd heard, that the goal of the Hamas people was to take hostages. So they took hostages. They took whoever they wanted. There were fights, but the vast majority of the non-military hostages were taken just by, groups of young men or this family or that clan. When the Hamas leaders last November wanted to return all the non-military hostages under that ceasefire of last November, it took them a considerable amount of effort just to find out where these people were being held, And they managed to find nearly all of them and get them returned. So, yeah, bad things happened on October 7th, without a doubt. Civilian hostages were taken, which is a war crime. And some of them were probably taken by Hamas, I don't know. there were the young women soldiers who were taken, who I think were still in their PJs, but they, you know, they had been serving soldiers on a military base, and they are still being held. So, of course, what we were told by the Israeli media is that Hamas came out with the intention of carrying out mass rapes and burning babies, or maybe it was beheading babies. You know, well, there were two stories. You know, they couldn't get their story. They I think in all of that horrible chaos that struck Israeli society on that day, there were maybe 3 people who were under the age of 18 who were killed, and 2 of them were teenagers. I mean, if you go through I went through the Hamas numbers, and there was 1 toddler and maybe 2 or 3 teenagers who were killed. So this idea that, you know, Hamas came to behead babies or bake babies alive or whatever, that our president seems to still believe and repeats on occasion as if it were the gospel truth. And he, you know, says, I've seen pictures. I know it happened because I've seen pictures. That degree of disinformation and its broad uptake in this society is very disturbing. So, you know, obviously there are some fine people like Max Blumenthal and Asa Winstanley and others who have really, it's a lot of it, this is in the Hebrew language media. That, you know, that actually the Israeli military, which was in chaos after the collapse of its southern command, total chaos, they had the helicopters come in and just do a mass Hannibal. And, you know, that's all in the Hebrew media. You don't see it in the New York Times, which, you know, allows people in this country to continue to believe the worst things about Hamas.
Thank you for that.
I got my question answered.
Ah. All right, okay. Well, goodness, this has been quite an...
Oh, yeah, I just have a question. It's more very broad, but I was wondering, you mentioned when empires crumble, it's very messy. And so I was wondering, like, within history,
When empires-
with this empire crumbling, how you imagine that playing out based on any other historical.
Let's hope not World War III.
So this is kind of, you know, 2 empires that we're talking about locked at the hip, and we could see the collapse of Israel without the collapse of the American empire. I don't think we could see the collapse of the American empire without the collapse of Israel. So if we saw just the collapse of the Israeli empire, in good part we are kind of seeing it already. You know, 15 months ago Israel was, you know, the startup nation. It was where all of high-tech money, you know, venture capitalism was rushing into Israel because they were so brilliant at all this stuff. Have you looked at the Israeli economy recently? I mean, it's like all of that money has stopped going, and a lot of it has flooded out of the country. And the economy is a basket case right now. Israel's relationship with its neighbors still has the treaty with Egypt, still has the treaty with Jordan, but those could very easily crumble, and that would be a huge blow. What I would like to see happen is to see, obviously not just a durable ceasefire in Gaza, but the end of Israel's occupation of Gaza for once and for all, as the first stage in the end of Israel's occupation of all of the occupied territories. And if we can get that process implemented by the international community, then I think without the occupied territories, Israel is going to crumble anyway because of the deep political fissures between the settler extremists and the so-called liberal Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox. I mean, the political fissures are so deep. Ilan Pape talks very informatively, very informedly, and very smartly about there being two states there, two Jewish states there right now, which he describes as the state of Israel, which is kind of the liberal Israel that people in the West have known and loved since the days of Jane Fonda. Whatever, I leave Jane Fonda aside. And then there is the state of Judea and Samaria, which is the settler state, which is, you know, to some clear degree at war with the liberal Zionist state of Israel. So how it will work out, I don't know, but it depends on us remaining steadfast, and it remains on, it rests on the peoples and governments of the global majority actually being able to implement a plan to save what remains of the Palestinians of Gaza and the Palestinian people as a whole and their rights.
Well, thank you. And on that note, yeah, let's hope that that time comes soon. So thank you very much, Helena Cobban, for your wonderful talk and for the book.
Buy the book. Give copies to all your friends. Holiday season coming up.
I'm going to assign you to the next Middle East class.
So if you're rapping, I'm supposed to give a pitch, right?
Beg your pardon?
If you are rapping.
Oh, I'm
supposed
sorry,
to
of
give a
course,
pitch before we
of
get out.
course. There is a table, and the book is available for sale. So please move over there. and the author will also do a book signing, evidently. Yes, thank you.
And please give some money to Just World Educational. Our organization is tiny, and you know it was already a stretch for me to be able to come up here, and we are, you know, desperately dependent because we don't take money from the Soros Foundation or any of the foundations. We are totally dependent on the goodwill of our friends.
So just to say that, so we're going to keep the book sale money and the donation money separate tonight, and the donations will be split between Napa Education Fund and Just World Education. Very important to support that group. She does a weekly podcast called the Palcast, and even though Helena is a Palestine specialist, Middle East specialist, she's ranges more widely. She did a whole series of programs on Ukraine when that war started a couple of years ago. So it's a really important organization that helps illuminate international problems and helps us understand how our responsibilities as a U.S. peace movement. So please give whatever you can, and also buy a book, and Helena's going to sign it.
Yep. By check or card?
So we can do check, we can do cash, we can do card, or Venmo. We've got 4 ways to pay.
Oh, you're on.
No great
Great. Yeah, of course, yeah. You know, the only quibble that I have is the analogy to text and the global environment is very different.
I've got a poster over here with their story. I've known them for several months so far.
Thank you for a tremendous
And
scope and
thank you for your time.
covering a truly international perspective. Were you suggesting that the folks who killed people at the grave were not Hamas, but a bunch of civilians from Gaza who had poured across the border?
So now you have to go sign books.
I wrote it.
Then you should come along.
I'm coming on.
I am suggesting that, but also the Israeli military who came in with the helicopters Yeah, I mean, they killed a lot of those people at the rave. Yes.
I didn't hear.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I think Cole wants me to be over there on the side.
You want me to take care of your bag and stuff?
Oh, well, that's kind of you, but
I just wanted to say thank you. I wasn't, again, I bought the book because I wanted to read it. I wasn't, it's the message.
okay, okay.
That you didn't tell me before?
I forgot I told you things that are really interesting. So I use a diet, okay? That I because I get pains and all sorts of pains because for inflammation. So I like to break it. I'll email you. I mean, where's the problem? You know,
Yeah, no, I mean,
I know, but no, the thing is, the problem is, there's a plant paradox. Plants have appeared for insects, okay? They're termed insects are like 9 million. So, I don't know, I mean, I'm just saying the number, but I don't know if it's a million or billion.
Are you with MAPA?
Yes. But anyway, so this guy, Stephen Gundry, is a cardiac surgeon. Yeah. He is a fan of this guy, and I heard about him. And I was into it. I was amazed. Really impressive. He lost 7 pounds. He walks. He's 77 years old. He walks 2 miles. He used to walk miles. So you're still eating. Really know what you can bring out. Sugars, fruits,